this clear. The Cholo culture and Chicano culture. Here on Chicano Tube, I'm letting you know that's not the same. That is not the same. I'm letting you know, don't ever intertwine the Cholo culture and the Chicano. The Chicano culture is something to be proud of. The Chicano culture is our parents who nearly sacrificed their lives to come to this country and give us a better life. The Chicano culture is all the plights and struggles that we had to do to get equality. That's the Chicano culture. The Cholo culture, that's different. To Charlie Browns and putting a little Charlie Brown on a 2-year-old and putting Ben Davis on a 2-year-old and putting hairnets on a 2-year-old, I say what Cholo Juan says, chaluca.
I'm going to respectfully disagree on this one. And this is why it's important to know our history, because to truly understand your culture is to know where your culture comes from. See, the common misconception is that Cholo culture was birthed out of the prison systems and gangsterism, when in fact, it actually was born out of the Chicano movement. See, in the 60s, young Chicanos started taking their inspiration from their predecessors, the Pachucos. And while most people think the Pachucos were just a bunch of small Mexican-American street gangs, they forget how those street gangs were created in the first place. Because they weren't created for criminal intent. They were created out of protecting the neighborhoods. Police brutality and white supremacy affected the barrios just as much as it affected any other hood. And the Pachucos took inspiration from the African-American community and started creating their own resistance to whiteness through the zoot suit and fashion. It was also a time when young Chicanas started asserting their independence and advocating and fighting for their civil rights as women. Fast forward to the 60s, where young Chicanos started taking action and fighting against systemic racial inequities. And not only were they fighting for the rights of Mexican Americans, but also for the rights of our people coming across that border as migrant workers. As many Mexican Americans were the children and grandchildren of farm workers themselves. And because of these racial injustices, many of our people got placed into the prison systems unlawfully. False accusations, false convictions, serving longer prison sentences for nonviolent crime than their white counterparts. So not everybody who got thrown in prison were gangsters. And as a form of resistance, young Chicanos started creating what we now know as Cholo fashion and Cholo culture. Their fashion was inspired by the Pachucos, being imprisoned and working out in the farms. They didn't want to look like the clean-cut American white boy because that was not how they were living. They wanted to show the world that we don't have to look like you to be equal to you. One part of Chicano culture and Chicano activism that a lot of people don't talk about is the resistance that came through art, poetry, storytelling, murals, and out of that, tagging culture and lowrider culture were born. What better way to show resistance to whiteness by painting a mural on your 64 Impala with the Hydros and the Daytons? What better way to show your resistance to government entities by tagging your message on their buildings? And through this resistance, the stereotypes started being born. They started criminalizing tagging and wall murals. They started making restrictions on how you can and cannot modify your vehicles. And they started creating the image that the Cholo was synonymous to the gangster. And this image was popularized in the 90s through Hollywood, with movies like Mi Vida Loca, Blood In, Blood Out, and American Me. And even though that helped establish the stereotype that cholos and gangsters were one and the same, it kind of blew up in their face at the same time, because the cholo image became a pop culture phenomenon. Look, I get it. Mexican identity is complicated. There is a duality in our identity that people know but don't fully understand. It's the struggle between the conquistador and the indio, the colonizer and the colonized. And then when these imaginary lines got placed in between our lands and separated our people, it then became you weren't Mexican enough because you weren't born on this side of the imaginary line, and you weren't American enough because you weren't white. The duality of our identity and that internal struggle that so many of us have to face and deal with is what has shaped our culture to what it is today, and has created many subcultures from that. So just remember, our culture as Mexican people as a whole was created out of oppression, but it was also created through resistance. And that's the duality of being Mexican.